Our next speaker is Jay Ock. He doesn't need much of an introduction if you know Jay. He's the Environmental and Regulatory Affairs. He's in charge of that for the Port of San Francisco. Anybody who has dealt with Jay knows he can be cantankerous. He will say what he thinks, and he'll make you think about what you're thinking about, which is exactly what we want to do. Jay's going to be talking about how, through their process of America's Cup, how it went for them for both the dredging and the reuse side of the equation. We'll also be taking questions in the last few minutes, so we'll begin holding up the blue cards, and if you have any, hand them to either Ariel or I, and then we will make sure that we get them submitted. Again, if you want to win that bottle of wine, you need to be here at the end. We'll take your name tags and draw it from here, and this will be videotaped, and all PowerPoint slides will be on our website by Monday. In the event you've been trying to take notes, we'll have those available for you. And as soon as we have the video ready, that will be posted on the website as well. And I'd like to now hand this off to Jay Ock, who has been great to work with. He's always a pleasure to work with. He makes you think, and that's what we need to be doing in our industry. Jay?
So, couple of things before we get started. First of all, my standard blanket disclaimer. The opinions I'm about to express are my own. They're not the official opinions of the Port of San Francisco. Also, I want to thank Larry for characterizing where we are in terms of LTMS now as entering the teenage years, because this enables me to now describe myself as a petulant teen rather than a grumpy old man. So I'd also like to say that Brian Ross actually, in a lot of ways, set up my talk perfectly. What I really am going to focus on is the financial aspects of attempting to do upland wetland reuse that's based primarily on the port's recent and first experience with this, which was pertained to taking material from America's Cup dredging to wetland reuse project. It was not a real happy experience, but Brian, want to get my quote right, mentioned that private dredgers are going to have to carry more of the load, and that agencies will continue to push them to do so, that the Corps basically is not going to be able to do as much upland wetland reuse as they did initially. Well, let me go to my time. Oops. Okay, thank you. So, thank you, Brian, because that's the perfect introduction to my opening statement here, which we can all regulate, issue decrees, whatever, but that doesn't change things either physically on the ground or financially for the entities attempting to do these projects. And so what I want to do is go through briefly the Port of San Francisco, how finances at the port work. Sorry for, I don't know how you folks are. I don't find finance particularly exciting myself. But nevertheless, it's really important to understand this in terms of context, because in the past, it's been my experience that a lot of agency staff really don't want to hear about this stuff, and it's not part of the equation in making decisions. And yet, ultimately, if this isn't part of the decision-making process, it just ain't gonna happen. So the Port of San Francisco several years ago, well, first of all, the port is what's called a revenue-supported public entity. We get no tax dollars. We're not part of the City of San Francisco budget. We're financially separate. We have to generate our own revenue from leases, ships coming in, tying up, paying wharfage, dockage, ferries coming, passenger taxes on cruise passengers, parking, whole number of revenue streams, but there's not tax dollar one coming from the Board of Supervisors or the mayor. We did a look a few years ago, first time ever, in terms of trying to estimate what the deferred maintenance was on our piers in order to try to put together a long-term capital program. Our engineering department came up with a number of roughly $1 billion. That's a lot of money. That's for the piers that are out in the bay. They're now starting to look at, well, what about the land side of the port? And there's a concrete seawall that runs all along the waterfront, beginning up at Aquatic Park, runs all the way down the waterfront to the ballpark. Built in the early 1900s, way beyond its design life, seismically not there in terms of codes. Looking at what's the cost of repairing that seawall, and it's underneath the edge of the, you don't see it, it's underneath the edge of the land. And looking at seismic issues behind that seawall, there is non-engineered fill placed, liquefaction issues, global sea level rise is going to potentially inundate a large portion of the financial district. What sort of infrastructure costs are we looking at? Probably at least another $1 billion. And quantifying that is going to be really tough. So, okay, $1 to $2 billion that we need. Here's what we get. The port has an annual budget of about $60 million. Out of that $60 million, we have a capital budget, which is big projects, of $8 to $10 million a year. Out of that $8 to $10 million, my dredging budget is now up to about $5 million. It's $4 million for actual dredging and disposal, another $1 million for all the other costs of dredging, the permitting, testing, inspections, pre and post dredge surveys, all that other stuff. So we're looking at $5 million out of a $10 million capital budget. I can assure you every year, and it's coming up shortly, when we have our capital project meeting, and I walk in and our finance guy says, okay, we have $10 million this year and Jay gets 5, everybody in the room hates me. But that leaves $5 million a year to try to deal with $1 billion in deferred maintenance on piers and another $1 billion for needed onshore infrastructure improvements. That's a fraction of a percent, which means we're falling behind every year just when you factor in inflation. The port is essentially falling down faster than we can fix it. Another way to look at dredging and the dredging budget is, okay, well, how much of the maritime budget goes to dredging? Total maritime budget is about $14 million. Out of that, cargo revenues, 5 million, cruise revenues, 2.3. You can read these, fishing, 2.1. Our principal facilities that we dredge are the top two, cargo and cruise. So there's $7.3 million of income, in essence, that we're spending $5 million a year in dredging to maintain. This is an equation that doesn't make a lot of sense. As those dredging costs go up, and I'll show you how they are going up, this equation gets even worse. And quite honestly, at some point, somebody in port management is going to ask the question, why are we doing this? Do we want to be in these lines of business? And nobody wants to go there, given the tradition of San Francisco as a port, but financial factors are pushing us there. So, what are our dredging costs? And sorry that these numbers are kind of small. They'll get bigger in the next slide. But it gives a rough idea, well, actually not rough idea. These are our actual contract costs for dredging and disposal at different locations. And I'm going to move this around so I can actually look at that as well. So, dredging and disposal at Alcatraz for us is about $11 a yard, $10.55. Taking it to the ocean, $21.55, almost double the cost. To upland wetland reuse as cover material, $23 a yard. And non-cover material, based on our recent America's Cup dredging, self-censor there, over $50 a yard. That's a heck of a lot of money per cubic yard of dredge material. Class 3 landfill, we take our material that's totally unsuitable for in-water disposal, which fortunately isn't very much. We take it, dry it out, pick it up again, and haul it off to Class 3 landfill. That's only $43.75 a cubic yard versus over $50 a cubic yard for non-cover wetland reuse. It's silly that the economics argue for taking dredged material to a landfill rather than wetland reuse, but that's the contract prices we're dealing with. So looking at, I just did this quick spreadsheet to give you basically an idea of how budgets have changed with LTMS. So I took our current contract price, the port dredges plus or minus 200,000 cubic yards of mud a year. That's a reasonable round number. It's plus or minus 100,000 of that, or probably average around 200. If all of that went to Alcatraz at current contract costs, we're looking at $2.1 million. 50-50 Alcatraz, the ocean site, 3.2, 50% increase. 2080 Alcatraz to SF Dodds, which is more in tune with where LTMS wants to go, 80% out of the bay, we're looking at nearly $3.9 million, so almost double the Alcatraz price. Once you start mixing in wetland reuse, if it's cover material, the impact isn't that great. We go from 3.9 to essentially 4 million. But once you get non-cover material mixed in there at $50 a yard, holy something, Batman, we're up to over $5 million per year for our dredging program. And again, in the context of a $10 million a year total capital budget, that's a heck of a lot of money. So I did this for the port, and then I thought, well, okay, I'm going to have some fun, if finances are ever fun. Let's take the bay-wide approximate total of $3 million a cubic, or $3 million cubic yards a year of dredging. Let's calculate these same numbers for $3 million or 3 million cubic yards and see what we come up with. And these numbers are pretty staggering. This is, I don't know that anybody's ever done any sort of estimate of bay-wide dredging costs. I don't know, I'm not claiming that this is anything accurate, but at least it's a ballpark idea, and you can see how these differences in disposal options affect the Bay Area in terms of overall dredging costs. So we go from almost $32 million dredging and disposal at all that material at Alcatraz, which we all know would not be permitted now, but years ago that was the scenario. If you get to the 20%, I won't go through all these, but 20% Alcatraz, 40% ocean, and split the other 40% of upland wetland reuse between cover and non-cover material, again, call in Batman, because we're over $75 million versus, I mean, that's a staggering sum. So the cost, if you will, from a baseline of all SF11 disposal the cost to a port like San Francisco going to the high-end scenario of 20% in bay, 40% the ocean, and splitting the other 40% between cover and non-cover material. For the port, it's a $3 million increase. Bay-wide, we're looking at $45 million a year. And I haven't seen anybody that has a spare $45 million floating around. So that's, I guess, the sad part of the presentation. The hopeful parts are, as we've heard previously, that there is movement with the new WRDA bill for increasing harbor maintenance tax usage as a whole. There's potentially opportunities to use some of that funding for upland wetland reuse projects. We all need to push for that. The Bay Area as an entity as a whole has a great opportunity in that Barbara Boxer is the lead negotiator for the Senate. And on the House side, we have Congressman Garamendi. I encourage all of you, just send a brief email to both those people saying we need more money for wetlands and get it in WRDA, because that will be helpful. But, and the other point I would like to make is there has been mention of the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. Again, $45 million in terms of the differential. They're talking about the Restoration Authority of raising maybe $15 million a year. There's a big differential there. I guess the fundamental conclusion that I have is that we're not thinking big enough, and we need to think big dollars. And it's not the ports that are going to fund this. We can't. We simply cannot. So originally I was going to leave this here and hopefully engage all of you in, if not Q&A or discussion or something, but I couldn't resist. The Corps and the EPA both mentioned the Corps' plan to reuse some of their wetlands material. The Corps, in their IAA, their Integrated Alternatives Analysis, which is a document that looks at different disposal options, initially proposed taking all their material, or most of their material. I need to read these numbers because I can't read them on my little bit of paper. So the Corps originally proposed no upland wetland reuse, 40% of their, 39% of their material to in-bay and 61% to the ocean. The deal that they worked out with DMMO staff, which frankly, I don't understand. And that not being able to understand is why this slide's on this screen right now. The deal they worked out was that in return for 15% beneficial reuse, that their in-bay disposal went from 650,000 cubic yards a year to 900,000 cubic yards a year. Alcatraz SF11 is only, the ceiling there is 1.25 million cubic yards a year. So basically we're giving the Corps 75–80% of the Alcatraz disposal in return for a couple 100,000 yards of upland wetland reuse. This seems to fly in the face of the fundamental goal of LTMS, which is to reduce in-bay disposal. And furthermore, for other dredging entities like me, giving the preponderance of the Alcatraz capacity to the Corps means that the ports essentially get locked out of using Alcatraz and locked into these higher cost alternatives that, as I've just explained, we have a great difficulty affording. So this seems like a deal to the devil to me. And while LTMS seems to be pleased with this, I call this a failure. So that's about it for me. I was staggered when I saw this, and I don't know how to understand the decision making, and I would love to hear from the agencies how you came to this. And I'm sorry, I need to apologize to the agency staff for sandbagging them this way, but this was a decision, you know, made in a DMMO meeting at some point with no real public input, and what gives? Thank you.
I don't have any cards here, and we do have a couple minutes. I think, as I said, Jay will put you on your toes, and you're probably thinking, oh my God. Does anybody have a question that they would like to ask Jay? John Briscoe, yes, sir.
Jay, would you please tell us what you really think?
There's something rotten in Denmark.
Good. Yes, Tom.
Just clarifying one, one of the slides said you had port, non-cover, you also had SF Parks.
Yes.
Is that Mountain Lake?
No, that's, so the question was in my slide for costs, thank you, this one, there's, on the far end it says SF Parks. That was for material that went from San Francisco Marina down by Marina Green that recently went for upland wetland reuse. So, and I included that because the $51 that I've got there for the port seems like a lot of money. It's not just us that are getting charged that. So that's why that's there.
Yes, Phil.
Hey, Jay. Hey, with all these wonderful insights and positive feedback you had here in your talk.
Petulance.
Thinking about that and what you know about the system and the needs of the ports and the finances and all that, do you have any bullet points or thoughts about how to address this issue? You know, the cost structure, what's been set up in the regulatory infrastructure, and then trying to marry that up with making this whole thing work. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Someone needs to get out their wallet. The question is who? And that's been the perpetual question. The unofficial, kind of handshake deal at the dawn of LTMS was that it was going to be the Corps. If the Corps is off the table, as EPA suggested, I mean, the Corps does the preponderance, the bulk of the dredging in the bay, and I don't know, have the numbers right off the top of my head, but it's, I don't know, half to 2/3 maybe? If the Corps is taking no material to upland wetland reuse, everybody else can take 100% there, and we still haven't met LTMS goals. So the Corps has to participate. The Corps has to participate in a big way. The question is, how do we get the Corps funded? And I don't see that there's any way to do this without significant Corps funding, and also significant funding for our Bay Area wetlands projects. And they've got to be willing to not just feel that ports are going to drag mud to them at $50 a yard. They've got to be willing to participate in that cost to get that mud to them. And nobody wants to go there because everybody thinks the ports are loaded with money. And I hope I got the message across that at least my port, we ain't got it.
Jim?
There's a lot of larger questions about how the Port of San Francisco gets its money and what the rent structures are and all that. So it's a complicated subject about the internal budgeting. But just on this slide, just because you put the Montezuma non-cover cost, I think the non-cover contract that we got was $28 or $29 a yard. I think the rest of it was because other people got that because it was debris and pilings, and they had to double handle that material. So the Montezuma non-cover is in $51.
That was our total cost for dredging and disposal. We paid a tipping fee to Montezuma of $28 a cubic yard.
People understand that.
So there's more involved than a tipping fee. We do have to dig it up and get it there too.
Yeah, and those, I was just gonna say, those costs are typically, not that entire delta. There was a lot of other, there's debris and all that kind of stuff in that material. But the bigger question, should the Corps participate? Yes, and I think there's a recognition, even at the Corps, they are this year, the open materials going upland. So I think that what you said is right. There needs to be participation all the way around.
Are there any other questions or comments? Jay, thank you very much for your candid